He owed money he had no way of paying, rent overdue, bills piling up, a car he could barely afford to keep running. This wasn't a man on the verge of stardom. This was a man on the verge of losing everything, drowning in debt with no safety net, no backup plan, and no one coming to save him. And yet somehow that exact same man would go on to dominate an industry that had already rejected him hundreds of times, building a legacy so massive it would eventually be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This is the story of how debt didn't break him. It forged him. Debt does something to a person that comfort never can. It removes every soft landing. There's no version of being deeply in debt that allows you to coast, to relax, to tell yourself you'll figure it out eventually. Debt is loud. It follows you into every quiet moment, every sleepless night, every conversation with people you love but can't fully be honest with about how bad things actually are. For Sylvester Stallone, debt wasn't an abstract financial concept. It was a constant, suffocating pressure that made every single day feel like a countdown toward a crisis he couldn't see a way out of. And here's what almost nobody talks about when they tell inspirational stories about famous people. Desperation, real desperation, isn't romantic. It's exhausting. It's humiliating. It strips away comfort, dignity, and often the ability to think clearly about anything beyond immediate survival. Most people in that position don't rise, they break. They compromise their dreams for whatever quick, safe option finally makes the pressure stop. And nobody would have blamed him if he'd done exactly that. But something different happened. Instead of letting debt convince him to give up on the one thing he actually believed in, a script he had written about an underdog boxer nobody expected to win, he let that debt become a kind of fuel most people never learn to access. When producers finally offered him real money for that script, enough to instantly solve every financial problem crushing him, he said no, because they wanted someone else to star in the role he'd written for himself. Think about that. A man buried in debt, with every logical reason in the world to take guaranteed money and finally breathe again, chose instead to gamble everything on a belief nobody else shared. This wasn't reckless. This was a specific, deliberate kind of conviction that only desperation that has already stripped away every illusion can produce. When you have nothing left to protect, when comfort has already been completely removed from the equation, the fear of losing what little you have starts losing its grip, because there's genuinely nothing left to lose that hasn't already been threatened. That's the strange, brutal gift buried inside extreme financial pressure. It can either paralyze you completely, or it can free you from the fear that keeps most comfortable people playing it safe. He held out. Producers raised the offer. He refused again. They lowered it dramatically, testing exactly how far his resolve would bend under continued financial pressure. He still refused, holding on to the one condition that actually mattered to him. He had to play the role himself. Eventually, they agreed, but for a fraction of what he could have walked away with by simply selling the script alone. He was still in debt. He still had no guarantee this gamble would work, but he had something far more valuable than financial security in that moment. He had proof that he was willing to bet everything on himself, even when every rational voice around him said that was insane. That film was Rocky. It didn't just pull him out of debt. It didn't just launch a career. It created a cultural phenomenon that would define an entire genre, win major awards, and build the foundation for a legacy that would eventually dominate not just film, but business ventures, brand deals, and an entertainment empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But none of that happens if he takes the safe money. None of it happens if debt convinces him to compromise on the one thing he actually believed in. This is the real lesson buried underneath the fame and the box office records. Debt isn't just a financial burden, it's a pressure test that reveals exactly what a person actually believes about themselves when every external circumstance is screaming at them to give up. Most people, understandably, fold under that pressure, but every once in a while someone lets that same crushing weight become the exact force that pushes them to bet everything on their own conviction, and when that bet finally pays off, it doesn't just solve the debt. It builds an empire so massive that the debt becomes nothing more than the opening chapter of a much bigger story. Debt has a specific psychological texture that separates it from almost every other kind of hardship a person can experience, and understanding this texture is essential to understanding why it can, in rare cases, become a strange source of liberation rather than pure destruction. Most forms of adversity arrive and eventually pass, giving a person periods of relief in between difficult moments. Debt doesn't work this way. It's persistent in a uniquely invasive manner, following a person into spaces that would otherwise offer escape, into sleep, disrupted by calculations running through an exhausted mind about how to cover next week's expenses, into relationships strained by the inability to be fully honest about how precarious the situation actually is, into simple daily decisions, like whether a basic purchase is truly necessary, that most people never have to consciously weigh at all. For Sylvester Stallone, during the period before Rocky existed as anything more than an idea scribbled onto paper, this kind of debt wasn't a temporary inconvenience to be managed until the next paycheck arrived. It was a constant grinding presence that shaped nearly every decision available to him. Rent that couldn't reliably be paid on time, basic living expenses that required careful, anxious calculation rather than casual spending. The kind of financial pressure that doesn't simply limit lifestyle choices, but actively narrows the entire field of what feels possible, because survival itself starts consuming so much mental and emotional bandwidth that ambitious, uncertain long-term goals begin to feel like unaffordable luxuries reserved for people with more stable circumstances. This is precisely why the specific choice he made deserves far more attention than it typically receives in retellings that jump quickly from struggle to triumph, without lingering on the actual mechanics of what made that transition possible. When debt reaches a severe enough level, something counterintuitive begins to happen inside a person's relationship with risk. Comfortable people with financial cushions and stable safety nets, tend to approach major decisions cautiously because they have something concrete to lose if a risky bet doesn't pay off: savings, stability, the comfortable baseline they've worked to establish. This caution is entirely rational. Protecting what you have is a sensible response when you actually have something worth protecting. But debt strips this calculation away entirely because there's no comfortable baseline left to protect. When someone is already behind on rent, already struggling to cover basic necessities, already living inside a level of financial precarity that would terrify someone with a stable job and steady income, the traditional fear that keeps most people playing it safe simply has less material to work with. What exactly is there to lose by turning down a guaranteed payout in favor of a longer shot bet on yourself when the current situation is already this unstable? The floor has already in a sense been reached. This doesn't mean the situation isn't terrifying, it absolutely was, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But it means the specific fear of losing comfortable stability, the fear that so often prevents people with more to lose from taking meaningful risks, had far less power over someone whose stability had already effectively collapsed. This is the exact psychological space Stallone found himself operating within when producers offered him a genuinely life-changing amount of money for his script, contingent on someone else playing the lead role he had written specifically for himself. A person with financial stability, weighing this same offer, might reasonably calculate that turning down guaranteed money in favor of an uncertain, unproven bet represented too much risk relative to what they already had worth protecting. But Stallone wasn't weighing this decision from a position of stability. He was weighing it from a position where the debt itself had already removed most of what would typically make someone risk-averse. The rent was already overdue regardless of which choice he made. The financial pressure was already present regardless of the outcome. In this specific, brutal sense, being buried in debt had already stripped away the comfortable baseline that usually makes people protective and cautious, leaving behind something almost paradoxical, a kind of freedom to gamble that people with more to lose rarely access. This doesn't mean debt is secretly a hidden advantage everyone should seek out, and it would be irresponsible to suggest financial desperation is somehow a strategic asset worth pursuing deliberately. The overwhelming majority of people who face severe debt don't experience some hidden liberation from it. They experience genuine, prolonged suffering that often narrows their options rather than expanding their courage. What made Stallone's specific situation different wasn't the debt itself, but what he chose to do with the particular psychological freedom that extreme financial pressure occasionally, unpredictably provides. He recognized, whether consciously or instinctively, that his current circumstances were already so unstable that betting everything on his own conviction couldn't actually make his situation meaningfully worse than it already was. And in recognizing that, the fear that keeps so many people from ever taking their biggest possible risk simply had far less remaining power over his final decision. Turning down guaranteed money while buried in debt is one of those decisions that sounds admirable in hindsight, once the outcome is already known and the story has been told 1,000 times as an inspiring example of believing in yourself. But stripped of that hindsight, examined honestly in the actual moment it happened, this decision looks almost irrational, and understanding exactly why it wasn't reckless requires separating it carefully from decisions that simply look similar on the surface, but come from a completely different place. There's a meaningful difference between blind, desperate gambling and a deliberate, informed stand on something specific a person genuinely believes in, even though both can look identical from the outside to someone who doesn't understand the reasoning underneath. Reckless gambling happens when someone, overwhelmed by desperation, makes an impulsive bet simply because they're out of better options, with little genuine conviction behind the choice beyond sheer desperation itself. This kind of decision-making tends to be scattered, inconsistent, chasing whatever seems like it might offer relief in the moment, without any deeper reasoning holding it together. Stallone's refusal wasn't this. It was narrow, specific, and consistent, built around exactly one condition that mattered to him, rather than a broad, unfocused willingness to gamble on anything that came along. This distinction matters enormously because it reveals something important about what was actually happening underneath the decision. He wasn't refusing all offers indiscriminately, holding out stubbornly for maximum money, regardless of circumstances. He was refusing one very specific condition, being separated from the lead role in a story he had written, one that mirrored his own life so closely that starring in it wasn't simply about ego or ambition, but about something closer to authenticity. The producers weren't offering him nothing. They were offering him significant, life-changing money, repeatedly, at multiple different price points, testing whether his resolve would eventually bend under enough financial pressure. Each time, his answer remained consistent, not because he was chasing an even bigger payout through negotiation tactics, but because the actual issue was never really about the amount of money on the table at all. It was about who would be allowed to tell this particular story. This consistency across multiple offers is what separates conviction from desperation-driven impulsiveness. And it's worth sitting with this distinction carefully, because it's often misunderstood in retellings that flatten the story into a simple "he bet on himself" and one narrative without examining the actual decision-making process underneath. If his refusal had simply been reckless desperation, it likely would have cracked at some point during the escalating and then dramatically decreasing offers, because desperate impulsiveness tends to be unstable, swayed easily by shifting circumstances and increased pressure. Instead, his position remained remarkably stable throughout the entire negotiation, regardless of which direction the financial incentives moved. This stability suggests something closer to genuine conviction rather than simple desperation dressed up afterward as courage. This is also where the debt itself played a more complicated role than simply removing fear entirely, as if desperation alone explains the whole decision. The debt created the pressure and the stakes, certainly, and it stripped away much of the traditional caution that financial stability tends to produce. But the debt alone doesn't explain why he specifically held on to this particular condition rather than simply grabbing whatever money was offered and figuring out the rest later, which would have been an entirely understandable response to severe financial pressure. What explains that specific consistency is something the debt didn't create, but rather something the debt tested and ultimately revealed. A genuine, pre-existing belief that this story needed to be told through him specifically, a belief strong enough to survive direct confrontation with genuine, severe financial desperation. This reveals something important about the relationship between hardship and conviction that extends well beyond this particular story. Severe pressure doesn't create genuine belief in something out of nothing. What it does is reveal whether a belief that already existed is actually strong enough to survive real testing. or whether it was only ever a comfortable, low-stakes preference that quietly dissolves the moment real pressure gets applied to it. Plenty of people hold vague, comfortable convictions about creative projects or personal dreams during periods of financial stability, convictions that feel important precisely because they've never actually been tested against genuine desperation. Severe financial pressure functions almost like a filter in this specific sense. It separates convictions strong enough to survive real testing from preferences that were never quite as solid as they initially seemed. Stallone's specific belief about starring in his own story passed this test in a way that reveals something significant about the difference between wanting something and actually being willing to sacrifice comfort and financial relief to protect it. This is why the decision, examined honestly rather than romanticized in hindsight, wasn't simply a lucky gamble that happened to work out favorably. It was a specific, consistent stand on one particular condition, tested repeatedly under genuine financial desperation, that revealed a conviction real enough to survive circumstances specifically designed to break it. The outcome, the massive success that eventually followed, doesn't retroactively prove the decision was wise. What proves it was a genuine stand rather than reckless desperation is the consistency itself. The fact that his answer remained the same, regardless of how the financial incentives shifted around him, which is precisely the kind of stability that distinguishes real conviction from decisions made purely out of having nothing left to lose.